Should we dive in?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So you work a lot on accessibility with a lot of our clients, and I think internally you're definitely known as our accessibility champion. How did you come to be that within Silicon Reef?
So I've been UX designer at Silicon Reef for about 5 years now, but really I think I became particularly interested and a big advocate in accessibility when we did some work quite a few years ago now for the Met Office, creating their intranet, and they're obviously a public sector body, and accessibility is a huge part of their values and what they're about. It's also a legal obligation for them. So there was an element, quite a large element of accessibility testing as part of that project. So I got the opportunity to work with the team at the Met Office, attend sessions where we were testing with real users, getting to see the real impact of when accessibility isn't working well, what does that mean for disabled users, and really being able to see that firsthand, see the impact it can have on people, and when we do it right, how great that can be and what difference it makes to their day-to-day working lives. I think that was a real triggering point for me, that this is something we should be talking about with all of our customers and trying to push that needle forward. So yeah, I think that's where it started for me.
You say with examples like the Met Office, where obviously in public sector it is a legal thing, is it just that, or do we see with people where it actually can open the doors for lots of people?
Huge. Yeah, great question. So I think it's very easy to think about accessibility as it's for a minority. And I think that could not be further from the truth. You know, disabled people are not an edge case. They're a huge part of our population. And when you start thinking about neurodiversity, even, you know, people who are colorblind, it's such a huge spectrum of people that can be impacted by bad design or inaccessible design. So I think essentially what we're trying to do in our work here is trying to make the tools that we build as accessible and as inclusive for as many people as possible. And why would you not want to make, you know, what you're building usable for as broad an audience as possible? So I think that's the best way I like to think of it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. And do you think that message is shifting? Like, I think, I don't know, even in the time that I've been at Silicon Reef and the limited experience I've had with accessibility, it does feel like there are more people now that are open to the conversation of just making it a nice experience rather than just ticking a box because they have to.
Absolutely, and I think part of that is that you know, the EU legalities and web accessibility guidelines is being brought to the fore and spoken about a lot more, which raises awareness, definitely. But I also think the tools that we're using, like SharePoint, for example, they're making it easier to be accessible as well. So I think it's much more visible in the tools that we're using. So I think it's a little bit of both, that people are talking about it more. I also think it's no longer acceptable for it to be something that the minority are doing. It's an expectation that people are going to raise their game over and above the legal requirement. We are seeing many more people understanding the benefit to making those systems more usable, more inclusive, and all the positive benefits that come with that, definitely.
And when you say about the tools that we use, obviously we work a lot with SharePoint and within Microsoft 365. Are you seeing big strides being made there in terms of what's available to people?
Yeah, it's getting there. I mean, it's slow progress, but it is definitely getting there. There's a relatively recent release of an accessibility assistant in SharePoint, which sort of touches the surface on what we can check for in terms of accessibility, but things like picking up where color contrast is insufficient. So if someone's used a light gray font on a white background, for instance, it will flag that in the accessibility assistant to the content editor or owner to say this contrast isn't sufficient, some people might struggle to read this, and nudges them to make an adjustment. So things like that, and missing alternative text in images. So anyone who's using assistive technology like screen readers might be missing really valuable content in that image, and won't have that read out to them if there's no alternative text. So what I would consider some of the more basic levels of reaching accessibility for content editors, it is helping to flag those errors or areas for improvement, so that before they hit publish, they've got that chance to just have that sort of mini checklist in SharePoint on the page itself, and which I think is a really great start. And we're seeing that in a lot of the Microsoft tools, sort of accessibility assistants that pop up, and like PowerPoint. I don't know if you've seen what that does, but in terms of the reading order, there's some great little tips and tools.
So when we're looking at things like SharePoint, are there things that you see customers sort of tripping up on time and time again? So I imagine with something like SharePoint, where you do have to have a relatively good knowledge to sort of use it day to day, are there just little things that every time you see, okay, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the most common well, actually, some of the most common ones that we see, I think, are often the easiest to fix in many ways. So I think probably the two biggest are the heading structure of a page, which sounds like a really small thing, but for anyone using assistive technologies, that's essentially that's how they navigate the pages, through headings, and the structure, and making sure it's logical and hierarchical is really, really important. So seeing pages that don't follow that hierarchical order. So we're sort of talking in H1 as your page title, then you should go to an H2, H3, H4. You see pages where people jump in straight in an H4, for example, and it's just a very confusing layout then potentially for some users. Also using formatting of text to signify a heading, so making it a larger font but not actually making it a heading element, things like that. So focusing on how it looks rather than the structure of your content is a common pitfall that we see. And I think the other one is probably images. So we talked briefly about alternative text. And that, I think, is one we see time and time again. So in SharePoint, when you edit a image web part, in the property pane on the right hand side is the option to add alternative text. Or if the image isn't particularly important, it's very much just a decorative, say an icon or something that's not adding any context really to the page, you can mark it as decorative. So you've got those two options, but we see about, I'm going to say 95% of the time, there's no alternative text added and it's not marked as decorative if it is a decorative image. So we actually had a customer who had, a global customer with offices, some in Johannesburg, and they have notorious poor connection there. So sometimes we talk about situational disabilities, which means it's for a short period of time you're experiencing some of the constraints that someone with a disability might have. So for instance, if you break your arm for 2 weeks, you will not be able to use that arm, and actually suddenly then mouse usage might become quite difficult and you start to experience issues. So we had a similar experience in that office in Johannesburg where their connection was notoriously bad. So often images wouldn't display, they couldn't load. So what they were left with was just the text, the pure text content on the page. So where images had been used as, sort of really important diagrams or, org charts or, structurally, strategically important diagrams, all of that content was immediately lost for those people. If alternative text had been added, they would have been able to see the descriptive element for that image and understand the context for it. So all of that really critical information for those users was lost while they had really poor connection. So yeah, I think it's another good example of how it can affect all of us at various different points in our life. So that inclusiveness, it really benefits to take the time to focus on those key things. So I think heading, elements, and image alt text probably the two biggest ones we see.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point actually, because I think before I came to Silicon Reef, that wasn't something that I'd ever thought about. I think when you think about accessibility, you do, if you're not in the know or someone that's ever been sort of exposed to that, you do just think, oh, it's only people that have kind of permanent disabilities. But actually the situational side of it is, just as important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some accessibility personas that we created a few years back at Silicon Reef, and it outlines that element of permanent disability versus temporary versus situational. So we have some different personas, and we explain what this could look like for a person. So it could be I've got hearing loss, for instance, or I could be trying to work in a busy cafe, so I've got a lot of noise around me, and for that period of time I really benefit from having captions on a video. It might be they get home to a quite off, my home office, and I don't need it anymore, but in that moment those captions are really important. Without them, I wouldn't be able to understand what the video is about. So yeah, we often share them with our customers just to help them understand this really does impact absolutely everyone at some point, so it's worth the investment for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the first time I saw those accessibility personas, it really opened my eyes as well, because I'd just not really thought about it before. One of the other things I wanted to ask about, because I particularly like this example that you shared, was the use of emojis. So I think that's something that, especially now, we see it all the time, on LinkedIn, and I'm sure we see it lots on Intranet content as well. And it's, people like to be fun and think they're, showing personality by using emojis, but actually it can be quite confusing for people using screen readers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I recently did a small accessibility audit of a SharePoint site, and there was a really engaging news post but went a little bit overboard on use of emojis, and there was some bullet points. One of them was about celebrating colleagues, and they'd use the trophy emoji at the end of the sentence, but they'd put 5 or 6 of them, I think. So when we were testing the page on a screen reader, the screen reader reads out the emoji name. So it said whatever the sentence was, and then said trophy, 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 trophy. And that was the experience for someone with, with using assistive technology like screen readers. That's what they heard every single time this emoji was used. Yeah, and it was just a realization that it's funny for us to look at it as an outsider, but for someone who uses these tools, that's incredibly frustrating. I think that was a bit of an eye-opener for me as to emojis are great, they have their place, but being really thoughtful about how we use them, making sure that they don't replace important text. And I think also another awareness is how many emojis have taken on sort of other meanings through texting. So being aware that if you're using an emoji because of its subcontext or a different meaning, actually it's going to read out the name of that emoji. So that could be very bizarre if you're thinking it, in your head it means something else, and it reads out its actual naming in the middle of a sentence. That can be very disorientating for people. So yes, fun but used with care, I think, is the takeaway for emojis.
Is there anything else like that perhaps surprised you? Because I think emojis probably isn't something that many people consider. Is there anything else like that you sort of thought, oh, I hadn't really thought about that until you experienced it?
Yeah, so layout of sections within SharePoint is quite an interesting one, and something I perhaps hadn't considered before I sort of started to read more about this accessibility piece, was how we structure content within a section. So taking aside, how great it looks, potentially what you've designed on a page, thinking about how that's going to stack then on smaller screens or on mobile. So most of our content editors are designing on their desktop, their laptop screens, and we do see quite often, and I think it's an easy thing to miss because not everyone uses their mobile for intranet usage. And I think what we see is particularly the people who are doing the designing and the creating of these pages don't tend to use their mobile very often. So they create it on the desktop, and then actually what we see is the way that SharePoint stacks content is sort of top down, left to right, and we can see some very strange stacking of content once we go on smaller screens, where content that once lived together is now separated by other chunks of text, and suddenly that meaning and order goes out the window when you sort of shrink down onto a smaller laptop size or a mobile, which I think that can be quite surprising to people, because like I say, if you're not a mobile user, a lot of people don't think, I should go and test this on a device that I never use. But actually, there are whole proportions of audiences for our clients who that is the primary means of accessing the intranet, for example. So yeah, I think that definitely was something I learned the hard way, back in the day, and I think still is a bit surprising to our customers now. And again, it's a really simple fix, just testing on smaller devices. You can even do it on your desktop. Even just shrinking your screen is a really simple and great way to see how is this going to stack on smaller screen sizes, to make sure you don't, all that hard work isn't lost immediately and makes no longer makes any sense.
Do you think in that respect then that designing for SharePoint is quite different from designing for like a website, say, for example? Because I imagine lots of people are quite used to using quite intuitive sort of CMS tools for the website or external content or other things that they may have, where things like for mobile, it kind of automatically resizes and it kind of does all these things automatically for you without you having to maybe consider it as much. So is it quite different than when you're working with SharePoint?
I don't think it is, actually. I think the same principles really apply. I think it's just making sure you understand how that content stacks. So once you've got that principle of the order in which content stacks, then I think it's exactly as you say, like sort of external web content. It's the same principles apply. But when you start creating multiple column sections, I think that you can lose that sense of sections and columns quite quickly if you don't retain that sort of the inherent structure of SharePoint when you're designing. It can be it can be quite easy to undo all the good work.
So one of the other things that you've talked a little bit about is that kind of people designing for how something looks. Do you think then that's a compromise that people have to make when it comes to accessibility? Like you have to maybe compromise on some of like your branding elements or how visually pleasing something looks to meet those accessibility guidelines, or is there a happy medium?
I think it's definitely a happy medium. I don't think you have to compromise on something looking great because of making it accessible. There's some beautiful, very accessible websites out there, intranets out there. I absolutely think you can get best of both worlds, but you do just have to be mindful of going on visual design first. I think that's the difference. It's about making sure that all the boring bits are set up and working well. So like your structure, your content order, your heading hierarchy, make sure all of the foundation is in place, and then you can focus a bit more on the visuals. But making sure there's so many pitfalls around use of color, for instance. So making sure that where you are using color, that's not the only way. So for instance, red for errors or alerts. If you only use red to signify this is urgent, then for instance, someone who's colorblind, they may not see that red as red. They might see it as a green, as you and I would see it. So you've just got to be careful that yes, you can use color, you can use imagery, no reason why not to, but it's how you use those elements and making sure, for that example, that you're not only signifying this is urgent by the use of the color red. Use your text to signify that as well. So I don't think you need to compromise. It's just having an awareness of best practice for those various elements, and then it can look fabulous and be accessible.
I think that's what I love about the way that we talk about accessibility, is that it, you don't have to make that compromise. Because, as working in marketing, I like when things look nice, and it's nice that you can have things that still look pretty and still are branded and still kind of meet that visual expectation that people would expect from their, their intranet and their workplace tools, but can still be inclusive at the same time.
Absolutely. It might require a little bit of extra effort, but your audience will thank you for it, definitely. So it's
Absolutely
worth the investment.
So on that note as well, do you think then it's absolutely something that people should be considering from the beginning, rather than, kind of getting to a couple of weeks before launch and then going, oh, should we check this is accessible?
Yes, 100%, not an afterthought. And there's a really great opportunity that we find in our project work, during the sort of the design and build phase, we often create page templates for our customers, and see that as a really great opportunity. Instead of using lorem ipsum placeholder content for templates, that's a really great opportunity to build in best practice, encourage, if you've got a section where you've got text on the left hand side and then an image web part on the right hand side, you can use that text web part to give some really good best practice top tips around using alternative text for images, or adding captions, or your heading hierarchy. So it's just such a great opportunity to really add that rich insight around how to make your pages accessible, usable, follow best practice, and you can link off to other documents or other pages on your site that give more detail. But I think that's such a good opportunity to educate those content editors right from the get-go. So the first time they open one of your new page templates, you're guiding them through the process, because it's a lot of information if you've never even thought about it before. So it's a huge amount of information, and a lot of these people are taking on that responsibility on top of their normal day-to-day job. So they're squeezing it in around their work where they can. So anything we can do to make it easier for people to follow that best practice, I think the better. So I think that's one of the top ways we try to embed it really from the get-go. Oh, I suppose related to that, the best thing that we always recommend you do is involve actual users, representative users, people with disabilities, people who use screen readers. Try and involve the people who are going to use it during your design build phase. Test it, real life examples, and observe them using your intranet, your tool, and take feedback to improve it. That's the best way to ensure that what you're building is going to be accessible, is to let people use it and observe their feedback, because they will find issues, and that's great. It means also the team who are building it are learning, and you're including those people in the process, which I think is super important.
Have we got any examples with our clients where we've done that, where people have sort of set a really good standard of like, this is how you should do it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've sort of got it's a sliding scale, I think, on where people are on their journey. We try to meet them where they are. So some people are sort of on the maturity scale quite far along, and have got perhaps digital accessibility teams within the organisation who are promoting this and raising awareness and running training. So that's really great, because then a lot of that work is done and we can just support in our project work. And some people are at the very beginning of their journey. So we try to meet people where they are, if it's about raising awareness, and we can provide, for instance, those personas that we talked about, and make sure that we've got best practice in any of the page templates that we provide and all of the work that we do. We try and meet people where they are and support as much as we can.
I think that's quite important, because I can imagine if you are right at the beginning of that journey, it can be quite daunting to almost stick your hand up and say, we need help with this. But yeah, I think we talked the other day about as long as you're showing up as best you can, then it might not be perfect, but you're getting there.
And continual and knowing where you're falling down. And we have accessibility statements that you have to produce, which basically say, this is where we're meeting standards, these are our gaps, and this is what we're doing to improve and work on that. So that transparency is really critical, and taking the time to note where you are perhaps not quite where you should be, and putting the work in, like you say, we're not there yet, but this is what we're doing to work around that and to improve our offering. So it might be that you're avoiding a certain layout or a web part for now because it's not meeting the standards that you need to set, or you're aware that you've got a lot of legacy pages that are not conforming in a various way. So there's a project perhaps to work through all of those pages and update them, but that takes time, and you have to acknowledge that. But yeah, it's a journey, and showing that you're committed and making continual improvement is really important.
Are there any projects that you've worked on that have been really personally satisfying to you, where you felt I've really made a difference here, even if you haven't directly heard feedback from the end users, but you get the good feels? Yeah,
I think there's plenty of sites we've worked on where I think it's particularly when someone comes to you with a problem, we're really struggling with engagement on this, or it's just not clear enough. We're getting a lot of feedback that people don't know where to go. You know, this isn't working well enough for them. That doesn't make sense. So come with a fundamentally, this isn't working for our users, and we get the chance to review the content, review the site, the navigation, the journey through the content, and rebuild with best practice in mind, and obviously injecting all the accessibility best practice in there, and to be able to present that back, and you know, it looks better, it works better. But then see, we had recently, there was a site, it was about declarations of accepting gifts, or you know, making sure people aren't bribing you and things like that. And it was everyone had to submit a form once a year at the bare minimum, and people were just not understanding the value, the impact when they had to do it. It was a little bit complicated. There were various different, if you're this person, you have to do it at this time. If you're this person, you have to do it at this time. And it was all just far too complicated in the way it was presented. It wasn't an accessible site. So yeah, we revamped it and were able to present back sort of the whole package, in a sense that it was clearer, cleaner, accessible, not confusing, the journey was clear. And then we got feedback that I think it was at last reported 98% of people had returned the form, which was a record high. So yeah, I think that was nice. A very small example, but just seeing that it wasn't flashy, you know, there weren't, you know, really fancy banners and colors, and it wasn't like, it was a very functional site, but we made sure that it was really usable, functioned really well, and was accessible, and it delivered, and they saw the results they wanted. So yeah, I think that was a very small but rewarding impact from that one little site. Had a big difference.
And I think that's a good point to make as well, that it doesn't have to be like this big, huge overhaul. It doesn't have to be like, you know, a whole intranet. It can just be like a tiny bit that you change that can make such a big impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just through, you know, clarity of structure, grouping, logical grouping of content, they're all on their own appear like really small elements, but when you've got really clear purpose for your page, really clear structure, the language is clear. Something we see so often, you know, use of jargon and acronyms and just long-winded complex sentences that just make it hard to understand for everyone. You know, if you're tired, you haven't slept well, and you have to read a sentence 4 times to understand what it's trying to say, it just slows everything down, makes everything more complicated for everyone. So yes, simple things like simplifying the language, avoiding use of jargon and acronyms, and that was what we were doing with the content, just grouping content more logically, really clear headings, so you could scan the page and see at a glance, okay, this is the section for me. So it's really simple stuff when you break it down, but makes a really big difference.
So to finish up with one question, if you could give one piece of accessibility advice to everyone, what would it be?
Test with real users, 100%, always. That is the number one, because, you know, I'm not an accessibility expert by any means. I'm scratching the surface, and the most I've ever learned was doing testing with 5 people, using different assistive technologies, you know, different areas of the business, and just observing them use the product and the site that we built. And I learned so much in those half-hour sessions, so much, not just about accessibility generally, but also our application of web parts and our content on that page, and how we can improve it and make it more usable. So 100% is speak to actual users. That's always my answer for whatever, but it is definitely number one.